Life in the bustling heart of the city was all about survival. Skyscrapers loomed over narrow streets, casting long shadows that mirrored the weight Madison Blake carried every day. For as long as she could remember, her life had been a relentless cycle of work and responsibility, supporting her sick mother. Margaret, who had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, was all that mattered to her. Madison had grown up in a modest apartment on the outskirts of downtown. The peeling wallpaper and squeaky floors didn't bother her. They were constants in a world that often felt unstable. Her routine began before sunrise and ended long after dusk. Every day, she took the same crowded bus to Prescott Manor, where she worked as a housekeeper for one of the wealthiest families in the city, the Prescotts. The grand Hillcrest estate was a world away from her own humble home, its sprawling gardens and ornate halls filled with an opulence she could only dream of. Prescott Manor was a place of contradictions. Its beauty and grandeur masked a cold, rigid atmosphere. Catherine Prescott, the matriarch, was known for her sharp tongue and unforgiving demeanor. She treated the household staff as little more than an extension of the estate, necessary tools to maintain the perfection of her world. In contrast, her husband, Thomas Prescott, exuded a quiet kindness that set him apart. His rare moments of acknowledgement, a nod, a brief smile, were enough to make Madison feel seen. If only for a moment, Madison had become adept at blending into the background. Her days at Prescott Manor were consumed by meticulous cleaning and maintaining the grandeur of a home that wasn't hers. She dusted priceless artifacts, polished silverware, and tidied rooms so vast they seemed to echo. Despite the physical toll, she found solace in knowing her work provided for her mother. Margaret's health was Madison's priority, and the endless stream of medical bills reminded her of the stakes. But on this particular morning, as sunlight streamed through the manor's stained glass windows, an ordinary day took a dramatic turn. It started with raised voices echoing down the grand halls. Madison froze mid-task, her hands gripping the handle of a mop. She recognized Catherine's sharp tone immediately. Following the sound, she cautiously entered the living room, where the entire household staff had been summoned. The tension in the air was palpable. "My diamond necklace is missing," Catherine announced, her piercing gaze sweeping across the room. "A family heirloom, priceless beyond measure. One of you is responsible." Madison's heart sank. She had no idea what necklace Catherine was talking about, but the accusatory undertone left little room for doubt. Someone was going to pay for this, and the Prescott matriarch would ensure it wasn't her. "Mrs. Prescott, I can assure you, none of us would ever," began Harold, the butler, but Catherine cut him off. "Silence. I don't need your assurances. I need answers," she snapped, her gaze narrowing. Madison stood silently among her colleagues, her pulse quickening. She had always been careful to stay out of trouble, to keep her head down and avoid drawing attention to herself. Yet, as Catherine's sharp eyes scanned the group, they landed on her. "You," Catherine said, pointing a manicured finger at Madison. "You had access to my room this morning. Did you take it?" The accusation hit her like a blow. "No, ma'am," Madison replied, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "I didn't enter your room today." "How convenient," Catherine sneered. "A poor girl like you must have been tempted. Do you deny it?" Madison's stomach churned. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. The weight of Catherine's glare was suffocating. Thomas Prescott, who had been standing silently by the fireplace, finally spoke. "Catherine, let's not jump to conclusions. Madison has worked here for years without incident." His words were calm but firm, and for a moment, Madison felt a glimmer of hope. But Catherine's anger was unrelenting. "This is my home, Thomas, and I will not have thieves under my roof," she declared. "If the necklace isn't found, she's fired." The room fell silent. Madison's mind raced. Fired. The word echoed in her head like a death knell. Without this job, she couldn't pay for her mother's treatment. The thought of facing Margaret with the news was unbearable. As the staff dispersed, whispers filled the air. Madison gathered her belongings, her hands shaking. Before she could leave, Thomas approached her. "Madison." "Wait," he said softly. She turned to face him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I don't believe you took it," Thomas said, his expression sincere. "But there's something I need to tell you. Something you deserve to know." Madison blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. Thomas hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor before meeting hers again. "Do you know anything about your father?" The question caught her off guard. "My father?" "No," she replied. "My mother never spoke of him." Thomas sighed, his expression heavy with emotion. "I knew your mother, Margaret. Years ago, we were close, but circumstances drove us apart. Madison, I only recently discovered the truth." Her heart pounded as she waited for him to continue. I'm your father," he said quietly. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Madison stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. Thomas Prescott, the man she had worked for, the man whose family had cast her as an outsider, was her father? "You're my father?" she whispered, disbelief coloring her voice. Thomas nodded. "Yes, I only found out recently, but I want to make things right. You deserve to know where you come from." Madison took a step back, her thoughts swirling. The man who had loomed as a distant figure of power and wealth was suddenly part of her story in a way she had never imagined. Questions flooded her mind, but one thought stood out. How could this change everything? As the gravity of his revelation settled over her, Madison knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same. Madison Blake stood frozen in the Prescott Manor Gardens, Thomas Prescott's revelation still echoing in her mind. She struggled to reconcile the truth. How could the man she had worked for, a figure of immense power and wealth, also be her father? The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured hedges. The air felt heavy, as though it too bore the weight of this newfound truth. Madison took a shaky breath. Her emotio. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice trembling. "If you're my father, why didn't you tell me sooner? Why let me work here all this time without essay?" Thomas's face softened, regret etched deeply in his features. "I didn't know, Madison. Not until recently. Your mother and we were in love, but her family kept us apart. I was young, focused on building my career, and I didn't realize she was carrying my child. By the time I found out, it was too late. She was gone." Madison felt her heart tighten at the thought of her mother, Margaret, sacrificing so much and keeping this secret. But why now? Why tell me this after all these years? Her tone was sharp, her words laced with disbelief. "I saw you here, working so hard, and I couldn't ignore the resemblance," Thomas admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "When I confirmed the truth, I knew I had to tell you. You deserve to know who you are, Madison, and I want to make things right." She stared at him, the sincerity in his eyes both comforting and overwhelming. Part of her wanted to believe him, to accept this new connection, but another part felt betrayed, as though the rug had been pulled out from under her life. "I need time," Madison said finally, stepping back. "This is a lot to process." Thomas nodded, his expression understanding. "Take all the time you need. But please, don't shut me out. I want to help you. And your mother." The mention of Margaret brought a fresh wave of emotion. Madison thought of her mother, frail and tired but always full of love and strength. She didn't know how Margaret would react to this revelation. Would she be angry? Relieved? Madison wasn't sure she was ready for that conversation. Without another word, Madison turned and walked back toward the bus stop. The evening air was cool, the city lights flickering to life as she waited for the bus that would take her back to her world, a world that now felt completely unfamiliar. The next morning, Madison awoke to the sound of Margaret coughing in the next room. She rushed to her mother's side, the worry etched on her face, a constant companion. Margaret offered her a weak smile, her pale hand resting on the threadbare blanket. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice raspy but kind. "You worry too much." Madison forced a smile, her heart heavy. "It's my job to worry. How are you feeling today? Margaret hesitated, then shrugged. About the same. But tell me, how was work yesterday? You look distracted. Madison's stomach churned. She had always been honest with her mother. But this was different. How could she possibly tell her the truth? It was eventful. Madison said carefully. Mrs. Prescott accused me of stealing her diamond necklace. Margaret's eyes widened. What? That's ridiculous. You'd never do such a thing. I know, Madison said, her voice tight. But that's not all. Thomas Prescott, he told me something. Margaret's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. What did he say? Madison hesitated, then took a deep breath. He said he's my father. The room fell silent. The only sound the faint hum of traffic outside. Margaret's eyes filled with a mixture of shock and sorrow. She looked away, her hands trembling. Mom, is it true? Madison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. Yes, she said finally. It's true. Thomas is your father. Madison's breath caught. Hearing the confirmation from her mother made it feel all the more real. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her tone a mix of hurt and confusion. Margaret turned to face her, her eyes filled with regret. I was trying to protect you. Madison, Thomas's family wouldn't have accepted us back then. They forced me to leave, and I didn't want you to grow up feeling unwanted. But I worked for him for years, Madison said, her voice rising. I deserve to know the truth. I know, Margaret said softly, and I'm so sorry. But I thought I was doing what was best for you. You're all I've ever had. Madison, I didn't want to risk losing you. The weight of her mother's words settled over her like a heavy blanket. Madison wanted to be angry, but she couldn't ignore the pain in Margaret's voice. Her mother had made sacrifices Madison could barely comprehend. I need to figure out what this means, Madison said finally. For me. For us. Margaret nodded, her expression weary. Whatever you decide, Madison, just know that I love you, and I only ever wanted the best for you. Later that day, Madison found herself back at Prescott Manor, her steps hesitant as she approached the grand doors. Catherine Prescott's cold glare greeted her immediately. What are you doing here? Catherine demanded, her tone sharp. I came to speak with Thomas, Madison said firmly. He's in his study, Catherine said with a sneer. Don't take too long. Madison ignored the venom in Catherine's voice and made her way to the study. She found Thomas sitting at his desk, his hands clasped together as though he had been waiting for her. Madison, he said, standing as she entered. I'm glad you came. I talked to my mom, Madison said, her voice steady. She confirmed everything. Thomas's expression softened. I know this isn't easy for you, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what. Madison hesitated, then said, I don't know what to do with all of this, but if you're serious about being my father, then we need to start with honesty. No more secrets. Thomas nodded, his gaze earnest. Agreed. I'll tell you everything you want to know. As Madison sat down, she felt a glimmer of hope. It wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. Madison Blake spent the next few days trying to navigate the emotional storm that had taken over her life. Between her mother's revelation and Thomas Prescott's earnest efforts to connect with her, she felt as though she were standing on unsteady ground. Every question she asked seemed to unravel another layer of secrets, leaving her both closer to the truth and more uncertain of where she stood. Meanwhile, Prescott Manor remained a tense place. Catherine Prescott had made her disdain for Madison clear, her sharp words cutting like knives every time they crossed paths. Madison tried to avoid her as much as possible, focusing instead on her conversations with Thomas, which had become a lifeline in this newfound relationship. One evening, as Madison sat in Thomas's study, she finally voiced a question that had been gnawing at her. Why didn't you fight for her? For my mom. I mean, if you loved her, why didn't you try harder to stay together? Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression heavy with regret. I was young, Madison, too focused on the expectations placed on me by my family. They wanted me to marry someone who could elevate our status, not someone they saw as beneath us. I didn't realize until it was too late what I was giving up. By the time I tried to find your mother, she was gone, and I had no idea where to start." Madison studied his face, searching for signs of dishonesty, but she found none. His regret felt genuine, and though it didn't erase the years of absence, it softened her anger. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Every day," Thomas admitted. "Not just losing your mother, but the time I missed with you. I should have done better, Madison, and I can't change the past, but I want to do right by you now." Before Madison could respond, the door to the study swung open, and Catherine entered. Her icy glare darted between Madison and Thomas. "What's going on here?" she demanded. "We're talking," Thomas said evenly. "Something we should have done a long time ago." Catherine's lip curled in disdain. "I don't understand why you're entertaining this nonsense. She doesn't belong here." "Catherine," Thomas said firmly, "this is my daughter. She has every right to be here." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Catherine's face twisted in anger, but she said nothing more. With a huff, she turned and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry about her," he said. "She's not an easy person to deal with." Madison nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. Catherine's hostility only reinforced how far removed she felt from the Prescott world. But Thomas's unwavering support gave her a glimmer of hope. In the weeks that followed, Madison began to see changes in her life. Thomas took steps to integrate her into the family, though it wasn't without its challenges. He invited her to join him at family dinners, much to Catherine's displeasure, and even offered to help with Margaret's medical expenses. At first, Madison hesitated to accept his help. She had spent her entire life working hard to provide for her mother, and the idea of relying on someone else, especially someone as powerful as Thomas, felt foreign. But as Margaret's condition worsened, Madison realized she couldn't do it alone. One afternoon, as she sat by Margaret's bedside, she told her mother about Thomas's offer. "What do you think I should do?" Madison asked, her voice trembling. Margaret reached for her hand, her grip weak but steady. "You should let him help, Madison. He's your father, and he wants to be there for you. Don't let pride keep you from accepting love when it's offered." Madison nodded, tears filling her eyes. She leaned forward and kissed her mother's forehead, silently vowing to make the most of the time they had left. With Thomas's help, Margaret received the care she needed, and though her condition remained serious, her spirits lifted. Madison found herself spending more time at Prescott Manor, growing closer to Thomas and even beginning to see glimpses of warmth in Catherine. It wasn't an easy road, but the walls between them began to crack, revealing the possibility of a real family bond. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Madison stood in the gardens of Prescott Manor, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. Thomas joined her, his presence calm and steady. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice soft. "So have you," Madison replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm proud of you, Madison, for your strength, your resilience. You've taught me more about what it means to be a parent than I ever thought possible." Madison felt a lump form in her throat. She turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you've shown me that it's never too late to start over." As they stood there, the tension and pain of the past seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet promise of a better future. Madison knew there would still be challenges ahead, but she also knew she wouldn't face them alone. She had her father, her mother, and a newfound sense of belonging. Her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined, but for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Madison Blake, the daughter of Thomas Prescott, was no longer invisible. She was seen, loved, and ready to embrace the life that lay ahead. Thank you for joining us on Madison's journey. What did you think of her story? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartfelt stories.